They invited me to talk to you all tonight. Thank you all to you for coming, and it's a Thursday night. Why would you want to be here? I'm really impressed that you're actually here. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, just so you don't have to take any notes or feel compelled to memorize data. I brought materials of all of the 3 research projects that I'm going to be talking about, so please just pick them up instead of trying to memorize everything. There's also a sign-up sheet if you are interested in learning more about what we do. Feel free to sign up for our newsletter on the sign-in sheet. So for those of you who don't know about ISPU, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, secular organization that is focused on the American Muslim community and context. So what we do is we do research, and we utilize that research to educate and raise awareness about issues impacting on the American Muslim community and about the community itself. And we also use our research to enable policymakers, the media, activists, advocates, religious leaders, community leaders, to actually utilize our research in their own really important work. And we do all this for 3 main goals, to achieve 3 main goals. One is to build understanding between communities. 2 is to safeguard American pluralism. And 3 is to help catalyze and support development within the American Muslim community. So our research is both for and about the American Muslim context. We were founded in Michigan about 15 years ago. We're celebrating our 15-year anniversary this year. And we now work nationwide. What I'm sharing with you today comes from 3 of our many research reports. 2 polls. We conduct a survey of American Muslims alongside the general public and other American faith groups every year. So I'm going to be drawing from data from both the 2016 survey and the 2017 survey. And I'm also going to be drawing from data from a project that we're doing called Muslims for American Progress, which looks at the contributions of American Muslims within our nation. So just a little bit about myself. This is definitely a personal mission for me to safeguard American pluralism. With a Jewish mother, a Christian father who happens to be a Protestant Catholic hybrid himself, married to a Muslim man, I certainly have had my fair share of misunderstanding from all sides. My Christian grandmother once introduced my husband by saying, "He's Muslim, but he's not really very scary," which was sort of an embarrassing way to be introduced to a group of people. My Jewish grandmother once at lunch very nonchalantly said, "Well, all of the Arabs want to push all of us Jews into the sea. Not you, dear." to my husband, who was very graciously, didn't get really angry. And my Muslim in-laws have negatively reacted to various things, including any positive mention of Israel or the Jewish community. So they like me and my family, but there have been dicey moments there too. So this is really a personal mission for me, and I can see it in the microcosm of my own experience and family, and I can see it in our nation. So let's get started. The topic at hand, which is, who are American Muslims in 2017? Who is this group that is so often talked about and so honestly rarely talked to? Despite the fact that Muslims have been in the United States since before we were even a country, and many slaves, up to 1/3 of the slaves that were brought here, were estimated to be Muslim, the reality is that most Americans know very little about Islam, and they know very little about the Muslim community. Even though Muslims are your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends, your doctors, your engineers, etc. I want you to take a second and just think of the last time you saw a Muslim on television. You probably, I'm guessing, that they weren't inventing new surgical techniques to save people's lives. I'm probably guessing that they weren't conducting soil tests to make sure that communities were safe. I'm going to take a wild guess here and think that they were some nameless, shadowy character that was probably up to no good, right? That's probably what you saw. And the reality is that more than half of Americans, or roughly half of Americans, don't know a Muslim personally, so what they do get often comes from television or from the media. And studies have shown, one group, there are many studies that look at media content analysis, but one group, Media Tenor, based out of Germany, did a study looking at Western media reports of Islam and Muslims over a period of quite a long time, so 2.6 million Western news articles. And what they found is that 9 out of 10 stories about Islam and Muslims were negative. So it's not really surprising, given this fact, that Muslims are in fact the least trusted faith group in this country. But who are they? Who is this group that, that so many people talk about? There's roughly, there are roughly 3.5 million Muslims in the United States today. That's Pew's estimate. Although there are a lot of estimates that you'll read, anywhere from 3 million to like 8 million. We go with the conservative number, which is about 3.5 million. And the reality is that Muslims are very much like many other Americans, as you'll see in a little bit. And they very much mirror their fellow Americans. Their political leanings are much like the Jewish community. Their political priorities are much like the African American community. Their levels of religiosity mirror Christian communities. The challenges that young Muslims face are almost exactly the same as their non-Muslim peers. And Muslim priorities are very similar to most Americans, with jobs and the economy being the #1 thing that people care about. And Muslims, like every other community, have pretty amazing people doing pretty amazing things that you really rarely hear about. I want to just start with a few data points from a case study that we did. It's a project called the Muslims for American Progress Project. We did Michigan as a case study first, and we're doing New York as a case study second, which will be out next year. But we looked at the contributions of Muslims in the state of Michigan to the health, happiness, and well-being of their fellow Michiganders. And what we found is that although Muslims in Michigan make up under 3% of the Michigan population, 15% of the doctors in the entire state are Muslim. And those doctors do nearly 2 million patient visits every year. 10% of the pharmacists in Michigan are Muslim, and they fill 15 million prescriptions every year for their fellow Michiganders. 7% of the dentists in Michigan are Muslim. More than 4% of the patents that were awarded in the state of Michigan during a 5-year period were awarded to Muslim-led teams. 35,000 or more small businesses, which is more than 4% of the small businesses in Michigan, are run by Muslims, and they employ more than 100,000 people in the state. And Muslims alone injected $5.5 billion, not million, $billion into the Michigan economy in 2015. So consumer spending was $5.5 billion just among the Muslim community in 1 year. And many of these folks are really leaders. Sorry, I meant to do that. Many of these folks are leaders in their respective fields. They're doctors paving the way by inventing new medical techniques. One example of that is Dr. Hai, who pioneered green light laser technology that makes treatment of prostate blockages far less painful and far less invasive, and he now travels the world training people in this technology. Juman Dole Alomare is a Muslim woman engineer, and she's a board member for the Michigan Underground Storage Tank Authority. I didn't even know such a thing existed, the Underground Storage Tank Authority. And what she does is she ensures that storage tanks are kept up to spec so that they don't leach really hazardous materials into the soil and the water of the community. I mean, that is a really important job, but you don't hear about people like Juman very much. So now I'm going to go into some of our survey results and what we found through our surveys when we did a nationally representative survey of Muslims alongside the American public on a nationwide basis. So I'm going to start with some demographics. Muslims are actually the youngest faith group in America. 37% of Muslims are under the age of 30. compared to 19% of the general public. So Muslims tend to be a very young faith group. And Muslims are also the most ethnically and racially diverse faith community in America. They're actually the only community without a majority race. There's almost exactly a quarter who are black, a quarter who are white, about 20% who are Arab, and 20% who are Asian. So there really is no one dominant ethnic or racial majority there. There's also a smattering of Hispanics, and actually Latino Muslims are the fastest growing group within the Muslim community. And the reality is that the Muslim community is starting to look a little bit like how America as a whole is going to look as we get towards the end of this century. By 2050, America will no longer be a majority white country. So Muslim community already kind of looks like how we will probably look in the future. Immigration is still very much part of the Muslim story, but not the whole story. I think we hear a lot about Muslim immigrants, but actually half of Muslims were born in the United States, and half were born outside of the country. And something that's often overlooked or people seem to be surprised about is that Muslims are actually the most likely faith group to be poor, to live under $30,000 for the household a year. I think there's a sort of assumption, because there are, in fact, quite a lot of fairly wealthy Muslim doctors and engineers and others who are very well educated. People seem to be surprised by the great poverty that exists within this community. When we look at education levels, Muslims are pretty similar to Christians when it comes to their levels of education. But despite this diversity and uniqueness, and Muslims are quite unique compared to other faith communities, Muslims do share many challenges with their fellow Americans and with other faith groups within our American context. One of those challenges is racism. This is not a surprise. America has an issue with racism. And Muslims are the most likely faith group to report intra-community racial tensions, which I don't think is very surprising given the incredible diversity of the Muslim community. But racism is not unique to Muslims. Actually, within most faith groups, and indeed the general public, African Americans experience racism at the same level. So this is not a religious issue, but really a social one in the American context. Another social issue that we looked at was domestic violence. And we wanted to look at this because, especially with the Muslim ban executive order, there was a lot of discussion about a lot of myths around how Muslims somehow are more misogynistic or more violent. And clearly this is not true, but we wanted to get some empirical evidence. And what we found is that Muslims, just like most other faith groups and indeed the general public, experience domestic violence at pretty much the same rates. There is no difference there. And Muslims report domestic violence to law enforcement at exactly the same rates as other Americans. What is really different when you look at the Muslim community is that Muslims are far, far more likely to report an incidence of domestic violence to their faith leaders, which I think is really interesting, because if people are going to their faith leaders, it's because they expect them to do something about it, right? It means they trust that they're bringing this very difficult thing to their faith leader, and that faith leader will do something about it. So I think that's interesting, that Muslims are far more likely to do that. And also it's an indication for community development that we really need to train faith leaders in what to do to deal with domestic violent incidents when people come and tell them about it. An interesting thing about the Muslim community, most religious communities are seeing kind of a drop in religiosity, right? Where young people are just not as religious as older folks, and young people don't take religion as seriously, and they don't attend services at the same rates as their older counterparts. With Muslims, we actually don't see that very much. Young people do attend services less frequently, but they still attend services more than their than other faith groups. And young Muslims are just as likely or even slightly more likely to say that religion is really important to them, which is different from other faith communities. Politics. We were not going to get away from tonight without talking about politics. And actually, a lot of the rest of this is about how Muslims are faring in this current context. So Muslims, just in general, are less politically engaged than other Americans, but not less civically engaged. When it comes to political leanings, Muslims much more mirror their Jewish counterparts. There are fewer Republicans and more Democrats, and quite a large swathe of independents. There's a large number of Muslims that are independent, that just don't feel like they have a home in either party. There's some social conservatism, which leans more to the Republican Party, but the bigotry and the rhetoric just, people can't find a home in that party either, and they're much more aligned with the Democrats. But Muslims, despite the fact that they're really impacted by politics, they vote in far fewer numbers. So you can see here that only 68% of Muslims were actually registered to vote, or said they were registered to vote in this past election, compared to much higher numbers for other groups. And only 60% roughly of Muslims said they voted, which is much, much lower than other groups. So people are feeling pretty disenfranchised. We asked them why they didn't vote. Such a large number didn't vote. Why did you not vote? And the main reason for not voting was just a lack of belief in the efficacy of their vote. They didn't feel like any of the candidates represented them. They didn't feel like their vote mattered. They just weren't really comfortable with their options. And so those were the main reasons. It's really interesting because many years ago, that voting is against my religion would have been a much larger piece of the pie. 15, 20 years ago, there was sort of a feeling within the Muslim community that it was somehow not okay to vote. That doesn't exist very much anymore, which is good, but now there's this sort of general apathy that voting doesn't matter or that their voice doesn't matter. But despite the fact that they are less engaged politically, Muslims are similarly likely as other faith groups to join along with their neighbors to solve problems. So they cooperate with their neighbors to solve problems in a civically engaged way in similar percentages to other faith groups. Now, it's not really surprising that Muslims disproportionately feel the political climate compared to others. Starting with children. Muslim children are far more likely to experience bullying than members of other faiths, and indeed the young people, in the general public. Far, far, far higher. Just over 40% of Muslim families say that they have a child who's been bullied because of their religion in the past year. And we know that these numbers are very underreported, probably for all groups, but definitely for the Muslim community. A lot of kids just don't tell their parents what's going on. Muslim kids seem to be very concerned about upsetting their parents because their parents are already dealing with so much stress and anxiety that a lot of kids self-protect and don't want to share that with their parents to make them even more anxious. So, these are probably quite underreported. I think for me, what's even more concerning is that in a quarter of these bullying instances, an adult was involved as a bully. So either a teacher or a school administrator was involved as a bully. And that to me is actually really terrifying because how do you deal with that when it's an adult in a position of authority who is not only not taking the bullying seriously, but they are perpetrating it themselves? For adults, the situation is not that much better. Adults are also quite heavily impacted by this current political climate. Muslims, not surprisingly, are the most likely faith group to experience religious-based discrimination, and the majority of Muslims have, in fact, had some form of religious-based discrimination in the past year. 14% say that it happens to them regularly. And Muslim women, Arabs, and young Muslims are the most likely to feel the brunt of this discrimination. And certainly for Muslim women and for young Muslims, they may be the groups that are least likely to be able to deal with it in the workplaces. Young Muslims especially, they're not established enough in their lives and in their career to actually be able to fight effectively against this discrimination. And bias and discrimination manifests in a lot of different ways, including in interpersonal relationships, but it can also be systemic. One way that sort of bias and discrimination have been institutionalized is through secondary screening, random screening at the border. And 30% of Muslims said that they had been stopped in the past year by border officials when they were returning from international travel. And this is 2 to 3 times more likely than other Americans to be stopped. And in these instances, 7 out of 10 of those people that said they had been stopped at the border coming into the country also said that their appearance somehow easily identified them as a member of their faith community, right? So they were wearing a long beard, or a woman was wearing a hijab, or whatever that might be. So they were visibly Muslim. And the impact of the political climate is also really impacting on people's sense of safety. People just don't feel safe. And 38% of Muslims say that they fear for their own personal safety or the safety of their families, specifically from a sort of white supremacist threat. It is important to note, I think, that 27% of the Jewish community also feel the same. So this is clearly a situation that is making a lot of people just feel very unsafe in their own country. And Muslim women are suffering from this even more than Muslim men. So Muslim women feel far higher levels, or more Muslim women feel stress and anxiety as a direct result of the political climate. 1 in 5 Muslim women have made plans to leave the country if it becomes necessary. It looks like 5% of them are going without their spouses because Muslim men are leaving in fewer numbers. And nearly half of Muslim women fear for their safety or the safety of that of their families. So Muslim women are feeling far more fearful than their male counterparts. What's interesting, though, is that the Muslim community is largely responding with solidarity and resilience. Marginalization can be really intersectional, and there are a lot of black Muslims. I mean, a quarter of the Muslim community is black themselves, so this is not surprising. But Muslims actually are the community that is most likely to support Black Lives Matter. They show a lot of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and Muslim women actually support in even higher numbers. Like I mentioned before, jobs in the economy are the #1 thing that Muslims care about when it comes to political priorities, but not surprisingly, combating bigotry and racism remain almost equal priority for the Muslim community. And this mirrors the African American community and Democrats quite generally. And the way that Muslims are responding, we asked about 3 different ways that they might be responding. And, a sizable percentage of Muslims have signed up for self-defense classes because of their fear for their safety. Nearly 1 in 5 have joined, donated, or volunteered for a civic organization for the first time as a direct result of the election. And again, 1 in 5 have increased donations to organizations associated with their faith. So Muslims are responding by greater engagement, by greater activism to this current climate. And Muslim women, again, are doing this in higher numbers. So more Muslim women are signing up for self-defense classes than Muslim men. More Muslim women have donated, volunteered, or engaged with a civic organization for the first time. And what's really interesting is, despite the fact that Muslim women wearing hijab are more targeted and probably more fearful, they're not modifying their appearance in any greater numbers than Muslim men, which I think is interesting, that people are just sticking to their guns and being who they are and not being pushed into becoming something that they're not comfortable with. So I want to end by just going through some myths and giving you some data points that we found that I think help combat some of these myths. So one of the myths is that somehow, I mean, I'm sure you probably saw the Twitter war between Trump and Gizr Khan, right? That somehow, she as a Muslim woman was silenced by her husband and unable to speak at the Democratic National Convention. Actually, Muslim women in America surpass Muslim men when it comes to levels of education. More Muslim women than Muslim men in America have a college degree and have either some college or have graduated college. Another myth is that somehow mosques are to be suspected, right? That they're dangerous. There are nefarious things going on. And, we've heard many times that mosques need to be infiltrated or watched. But we actually found quite the opposite. People who attend the mosque are far more politically and civically engaged than those who do not attend the mosque. They're actually forces for moderation in many instances. They're more likely to be registered to vote, they're more likely to vote, and they're more likely to cooperate with their neighbors to solve problems if they attend the mosque more frequently. Another myth is that somehow you can't be Muslim and American, right? That these two identities are just not compatible in some way. And we found that Muslims, just like every other faith group in America, feel both Muslim and American at the same time. There is absolutely no trade-off, and there's no difference between Muslims, or not much of a difference between Muslims and other faith communities. And actually, sorry, go ahead. And actually what we found is that Muslims who had a stronger religious identity also had stronger American identity. That there was actually sort of a positively reinforcing thing going on, as opposed to them being diametrically opposed. You probably have seen talk in the newspapers about these anti-Sharia efforts that are happening at the state level in many states. Another myth is that somehow Muslims want to impose Sharia law in the United States. There's so many things wrong with that statement that I don't even know where to start. One being that there is no such thing as Sharia law, but that's a whole other discussion. But we did ask about this because at the state level, there are all these legislative efforts to somehow ban Sharia law. And what we found is that Muslims are actually slightly less likely than Protestants to say that there should be a role for their religious beliefs in American law. So it's, this is not something that Muslims in America are trying to do. And all of these legislative efforts are honestly just a waste of time and money and effort, and they're fear-mongering against the Muslim community. I think this is the last one. Another myth is that somehow Muslims are prone to violence, right? That all these terrible terrorist attacks are taking place, and that somehow the Muslim community is more likely to commit these things. And we absolutely did not find that at all. We asked about whether attacks against civilians are justified, either when they're being committed by a military or when they're being committed by these small fringe individuals. When it comes to military attacks against civilians, Muslims are actually more likely to say that that is never justified. And when it comes to individual attacks, so from these fringe groups, Muslims, along with every other faith group, abhor these incidents equally. This is the last data slide, sorry. Calls for condemnation. I think you hear about this all the time, right? An attack happens and there's this outcry that Muslims somehow should be, condemning an attack by a co-religionist. And again, there's so many things wrong with this. There's actually, I think it's like a 270-page compilation of all of the condemnations that Muslims have given since 2001, but nobody is looking at that. People continue to ask for these condemnations. But I thought what was really interesting is that there is absolutely no agreement about whether Muslims should condemn these attacks when they happen or not. The general public and indeed most faith groups are actually pretty split on this issue. So you hear it a lot on television, these loud calls for condemnation. But actually, when you break it down, this is not a totally agreed upon thing. And actually, if you look at the general public, fewer than the majority say that Muslims should condemn. More people say they should not have to. So what now? I've shared all this data with you. It's available over there. It's available online. So what do you do with this? Well, I would refer back to Thomas Jefferson, who basically said that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people, and that an educated citizenry really is what an effective democracy needs. And so I think the onus is really on all of us to educate ourselves and others to combat bigotry. So I want you to, or I would encourage you to learn more, to help others do the same. And now that you know some of the data behind, or ways to kind of challenge some of these myths and inaccurate portrayals, that you can utilize this data when these things come up. I hope you'll stay engaged with ISPU. Again, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can always contact me if you have any questions or you want to engage us in some way. You can like us on Facebook. We do a lot of Facebooking, and all of our events that are in the DC area will be mentioned on Facebook. So if you're interested and you're a Facebook user, definitely like us in that medium. And I think I'll leave it there and just take time for questions. I'll try my best to answer them. I can't answer every question that comes up, but I will try.
Did you get any statistics regarding the different types of Muslims in America? Sunni, Shiite, secular, progressive, traditional, that sort of thing?
We didn't actually ask that last year. We're doing it again in January, and I believe that question is going to be on the next poll. We weren't sure what our N numbers were going to be and whether it would be a large enough sample to have an accurate breakdown, but now we know we can get an adequate sample, so we should have that in January.
And all these statistics were from Michigan only?
No. This is a nationally representative sample.
Okay.
Yeah, just on the methodology, because it is important. This is a totally legit nationally representative survey. We work with a company called SSRS, and they're actually, we were drawn to them and found them because they actually are experts on polling the Jewish community, a similar sort of proportion size of the U.S. public. It's very difficult to survey communities that are very small because you have to call just like hundreds of thousands of households to get, you know, a Muslim person to answer your questions or a Jewish person to answer your questions. So SSRS has expertise in that, and they actually are the pollsters for the New York Times. So they're a pretty well-respected polling company. So it was a nationally representative survey.
So what percentage of the, I'm sorry, third question in a row, but what percentage of people you surveyed were Muslim versus the other representatives?
So the way we did it, because it's so hard to get Muslims and Jews in a survey, right, we actually surveyed the Muslim community and the Jewish community separately. Like we deliberately, we used their omnibus. I won't bore you with details, but basically we called households that we knew were Muslim or Jewish separately so that we would get the right numbers. Then with the general public, we surveyed enough that we could pull out those who weren't affiliated, Catholics, Protestants, and others. Any other questions?
And along the same lines that the lady was asking, in the Jewish community, did you target by Reform, Conservative?
No. And that we sampled more Muslims in the survey because we also wanted to get some community development questions in there. So the Jewish sample was actually even smaller than the Muslim sample. So it wouldn't. The Muslim sample was about 900. The Jewish sample, I believe, was 500. And I know it sounds really small, but in polling world, they're actually statistically significant. And
You
nationally
also
represented.
didn't ask the Jewish groups.
No, I mean, it's too, the numbers wouldn't have been, when you break down a small number like that, it doesn't become statistically significant. So that, yeah, it wouldn't have really meant very much. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know where to start, but it's a great presentation, at least a good snapshot,
Mhm.
right? And as I was going through this, I still first started with the methodology,
Mhm.
having done consulting. right?
Yeah.
So obviously you gave the samples and all that. I didn't get a picture, even though you say national,
Mhm.
the distribution of any population, especially Muslims, or pick a non-majority white group out here, is spread out across the U.S. So to the best of my knowledge, I know you got Michigan is a stronghold of Muslims, and New York, New Jersey, then Washington D.C. area, right? So by definition, you're already limiting yourself. That's one. The second thing is you also mentioned you're talking to children and bullying and all of that, right? But how do you get a sample?
We didn't. Yeah, no.
So you get into a lot of difficulty in drawing generalizations and conclusions. So if I were sitting on the other end of the table buying a report like this, I would be hesitant.
This is nationally representative, and we didn't talk to children. So the way we, just so you know, I didn't go into methodology because a lot of people just
Yeah,
they
they go over
tune
their
out.
head,
Yeah,
yeah.
and the methodology, there's a whole, the questionnaire and the methodology is also available on our website. You can see it there. We didn't talk to children. The way we did that question was we asked parents, as far as you know, has one or more of your children been bullied? The exact wording of the question was on the bottom, but we asked parents. We didn't talk to anyone who was under the age of 18, because that brings up all kinds of consent
Because
issues.
if you poll children, other groups, you can talk to them. They'll tell you about bullying on the buses,
Right.
bullying in school. So other faith tradition children don't hesitate to talk about this, because this is a discussion that's going on between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the community group.
They're just different survey methodologies. So we are looking to do a more qualitative survey this year with Kellogg Foundation funding on bullying of Muslim children. That's a whole different methodology. This is a methodology that helps give us some clues, but it's not the only way to get at this issue. When it comes to nationally representative, it is nationally representative. They randomly call. The way the survey is conducted is the way Pew and Gallup and everybody does their surveys, which is you randomly call households across the United States. You don't focus on any one region. You
So
do
are you
random.
calling landlines or cell phones?
I believe we did landlines.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you see the number of, so this is another observation.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people now have already switched to cell phone. So if you're reaching landline folks, it gets distorted. Anyway, I'm getting too technical
I
here.
understand. I mean, all I can say is that,
It's true.
That's the same with all of them.
Yeah, but it's
It's the
true.
same with all of them.
but all polls follow. I mean, this is gold standard methodology for polling. The person who does our poll is used to head up the Gallup Center for polling of the entire Muslim world, based in Dubai. And the Pew Center is an advisor to our poll methodology, and SSRS is one of the few trusted pollsters of the New York Times, which has the most rigid methodology of almost any newspaper in the country. So I understand there are going to be limitations with any poll, but I can assure you that this is kind of as gold standard as you're going to get.
Meira, excellent presentation. Embarrassed to hear about your maternal grandmother.
Who is related to him as well, by the way.
But millennials are changing the world. Millennials and Gen Z, whether it was the attitude toward gay marriage in the U.S. that flipped within 4 or 5 years, whether it's the recent election in Virginia, where the millennials turned out in much higher numbers than expected, and not only helped the governor to run up a bigger number than expected, but helped to pick up 15 seats in the House. So is there, within the methodology, is there a way to say the millennials are different? They're less they're colorblind, they're blind to people's sexual orientation, they're blind to people's to religion, I mean, we know that from all kinds of research, not every single millennial, but generally they think much differently.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. We can separate to some degree. I mean, there were some slides that, I didn't show you all the details, but for most of the things we looked at secondary analysis, so looking a little deeper, and were there differences between young people and older people, or married couples and non-married couples. And we actually published, in addition to this basic set of slides that I shared, we actually have, I think it's 4 or 5 secondary analyses that are available on our website, and one of them looks, for example, at intersectionality and looking at sort of the racial issue and what the breakdown is of, you know, who has more solidarity with other groups and things like that. Pew, we did not ask the question about gay marriage, but Pew did in their recent study. And I don't know if they broke it down by age for that particular question. I imagine that they did. We try not to duplicate, because Pew advises us and we advise Pew, we try to ask different questions. So I can't paint that whole picture because we just didn't ask all the questions we would need to say that millennials are more progressive. But for every question we did ask, we did look at whether there were differences between younger and older folks.
If I could beg the indulgence of Meira and the attendees, there's a new book out about the KKK in the 1920s when it had a major resurgence, including in the North. It wasn't just in the South. And when they started, they're anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish. And there was a confrontation in New York City between a group of KKK members and the police. And the police told them to disperse, and they all did except one. And he was arrested, and his name was Fred Trump. Donald Trump's father.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, there are other questions that I'd like to ask. This is with respect to the United States, right? So you also have Muslim immigration into, say, the United Kingdom and to Germany. I'm talking about the Western, right? The white majority Western nations. So the experience is also different. So in one of your slides that you had, you know, that the American population, inherently there's a bias and there's a fear of Muslim terrorism and all that. How much of that is a reflection coming out of what is happening in Europe, especially coming out of England, where there is a violent Sharia law kind of thing which happens on the streets? And I don't have to name names, but, you know,
I can't answer that question because, I mean, as you know, surveys are very pointed questions where people give very short answers, right? So in my view, the value of these kinds of surveys is to give you clues of where to then dig deeper, right? So like the domestic violence data, we don't stop at that. That's a starting point for a conversation and further qualitative studies. But this kind of survey methodology just can't get at that level of detail. It's just not inherent in this kind of methodology. So I
are you
don't
feeding this back into the local authorities or policymakers, either local?
I mean, we've done
state?
Hill briefings, we interact with senators and representatives. I mean, we share this, it's been quoted in more than 100 media articles, all aspects of this poll. Yes, I mean, we work with policymakers, the media, advocates, change makers, leaders of all types around the data that we have. Anything else?
I just want to point out, you asked, do we know Muslims, you know, and I don't know if I know Muslims. I mean, I know a lot of people that I've talked to and befriended or whatever, and then I find out that they happen to be Muslim, but I don't know that.
I mean, I think that's true when you, obviously, again, the survey methodology, if you ask
I'm
some,
not
right?
criticizing
No, but my point is that it's sort of, it sort of doesn't matter that you don't, what I'm trying to say is that if people know Muslims but they don't know that they're Muslim, they're still not going to have positive associations with Muslims because of those interactions, because they actually don't know that that person is Muslim. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you know that a person's Muslim, you are going to develop positive associations with that person or that friend because you knowingly know them as this identity. If you don't know them as that identity, it's great that you're friends, but it's not going to give you, until you find out that they're Muslim, you're not going to have that positive association, right? You just think of them as whatever their name is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had asked if we think of a Muslim we've seen on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you were thinking in terms of like news.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking in terms of the primetime television shows.
Even there, though,
And-
there's very few.
I think it's increasing. I can think of like Superior Donuts.
Mm-hmm.
There's Foz.
Mhm.
He's a businessman. I think he's an immigrant from Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's recent new character on CW's The Legends
Mhm.
of Tomorrow, where only in the very first episode when she was introduced did we learn she's a Muslim. Otherwise, it's like a non-issue, which is kind of interesting.
It's great. There's definitely more things happening there, and it's the result of a lot of really hard work behind the scenes by a lot of different people. There are a couple of organizations and efforts. I can't name the studio, but no, I'm not good. Sorry, I'm not good. We were sworn to secrecy, but there are studios that have invited us and others to help them develop more accurate or more nuanced characters within television and film. And there have been a lot of efforts on that front, so I'm glad that you're noticing that, actually, because it means these things are working. It's good.
And they're fitting in just like, it's just another regular guy.
Right.
It's not even a show that's centered around them as being Muslim.
Yeah. And that's how it should be, and it's taken a long time to sort of start to get to that. I think Aziz Ansari, the comedian, and Asif Manvi, also from The Daily Show. I mean, there have been notable people who've kind of broken out. Kumail Nanjiani, the guy who just wrote this movie, The Big Sick. They're getting more popular, which is good.
And over the past 10, 15 years, when the credits run, I see the names of the actors with, I can't even pronounce these really, really long names. I'm sure they must be Muslim actors. But they're not even necessarily playing a Muslim, at least not to our knowledge. But it's interesting to see those foreign names as actors in mainstream television
Yeah.
shows.
Yep, it's good. You had a question,
I
sir?
was just going to say, in sports, especially football and basketball, it seems like there are a fair number of Muslims.
There are, and they've been, I think probably because of the fallout of the election and the concern about some of the rhetoric, I think people who in the past might have been more reluctant to use that platform for that, they just want to play football or basketball, right? They've been more willing to step out of that role. It's a tough thing to do. You're trained as a basketball player, right? And suddenly you're being asked, well, what is Sharia law? And you're like, I just play basketball. I don't know, you know? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is somebody who in the past has not really wanted to talk about his religion at all, and he's become quite a prolific speaker as of late, and he writes op-eds and things, so yeah.